I want to start with something that might surprise you because if you've been watching the headlines over the past few weeks, you probably think you already understand what's happening in North American trade right now. The images have been dramatic. A furious president demanding last minute concessions, talk of tariffs that could hit entire sectors overnight, commentators insisting that Canada is boxed in and out of options. But here's the part most people missed. The real story isn't the noise coming from Washington, it's the silence coming from Ottawa. And that silence is a signal. It tells you that Canada has more leverage than the headlines suggest, and that the old playbook for pressuring trade partners just isn't working the way it once did. If you've only followed the official narrative, the situation looks simple. President Trump announces steep new tariffs escalating from 25 to 35% and demands rapid bilateral agreements from every major trading partner. The European Union and Japan rushed to sign short-term deals, not because they love the terms, but because they hope to avoid deeper economic pain. Those agreements, at least on paper, let the White House say American pressure is paying off. But Canada doesn't fit into that pattern. Unlike Europe and Japan, which face broad tariffs across nearly all exports, Canada is shielded by the existing North American trade structure. Most Canadian goods already qualify for exemptions under the updated trilateral deal, and that flips the balance of power in a way many viewers may not have noticed. This is where context matters. When we talk about tariffs, we're talking about taxes on imports, but they work very differently depending on how supply chains are structured. Under the North American framework, the vast majority of goods crossing the Canada-US border already meet the rules required to avoid the new penalties. That means the threat of across-the-board tariffs on Canada simply doesn't carry the same weight. And when a threat doesn't carry weight, it stops functioning as leverage. Ottawa understands that better than almost anyone. And instead of scrambling to cut a quick deal, Canadian officials have spent their time quietly preparing for the worst-case scenarios. They're running models, identifying vulnerable sectors, and planning countermeasures, all while avoiding the kind of rhetorical escalation that would make compromise harder. If you're watching this as a consumer or worker, you might wonder why any of this matters for your daily life. It matters because tariffs reshape the prices you pay for everything from food to cars, and they reshape the jobs available in your region. The way governments respond to tariff threats determines whether your cost of living rises dramatically or only modestly, whether your employer faces new barriers or new opportunities, and whether economic uncertainty becomes a short-term nuisance or a long-term structural problem. That's why the difference between reacting and preparing is so important here. Canada is doing the latter, and that gives it more resilience than the surface-level story implies. The irony is that the strategy designed to make the United States look strong is revealing something very different. When the EU and Japan accepted watered-down deals, they signaled that they didn't have the leverage to hold out. But Canada, by taking its time, is signaling the opposite. It's showing that the tariff threat isn't as crippling as advertised, and that the U.S. no longer has the same ability to dictate terms simply by imposing costs. This isn't about defiance for its own sake. It's about understanding the mechanics of modern trade. When economies are deeply interdependent, the country issuing tariffs doesn't always have the upper hand, especially when those tariffs disrupt its own supply chains and raise input costs for its own manufacturers. At the same time, the global context is shifting. For years, the United States could rely on allies to fall in line because the alternatives were limited. But today, partners like Canada have diversified their economic relationships. They have other markets, other supply chain partners, and other sources of capital. That makes a unilateral tariff strategy far less effective. And when you combine that with internal U.S. policy volatility, From sudden changes in subsidies to abrupt swings in regulatory direction, it becomes harder for foreign governments to treat Washington as a predictable partner. Predictability, more than anything else, is what makes trade systems work. Without it, even powerful countries find themselves negotiating from a weaker position than they expect. What's striking to me as I look at this moment is how much of the real action is happening below the surface. On the official stage, you see deadlines and announcements and political theatrics, but backstage, the dynamics are completely different. Canada isn't scrambling to avoid a crisis. It's treating the deadline like a calendar event, not a national emergency. That's a profound shift. In previous disputes with U.S. administrations, Canadian leaders often felt compelled to respond loudly, to demonstrate toughness, or to reassure industry publicly. This time, they're doing almost the opposite. They are communicating calm, and that calmness is part of the strategy. It denies the tariff threat the emotional fuel it needs to work. You might wonder why silence can be such an effective tool in economic diplomacy. Silence forces the other side to confront the limits of its own leverage. When a country doesn't panic, when it doesn't rush to negotiate, it reveals that the costs being threatened are not existential, and that realization can create frustration for the government trying to use those costs as pressure. The Trump administration has relied heavily on rapid escalations to force deals, but that approach works only if the other side believes the damage will be immediate and severe. Canada's structural protections change that calculus. Most of its exports are already insulated, at least for now, from the harshest measures. That means the U.S. has to decide whether it wants to escalate further and risk blowback on its own industries, or whether it wants to rethink its strategy entirely. To fully understand why this works, it helps to look at how North American supply chains have evolved. For decades, industries like automotive manufacturing have integrated operations across borders. A single car assembled in Ontario may contain parts that cross the U.S. border multiple times before final assembly. Tariffs on those goods don't just hit Canada, they hit American factories that rely on Canadian components, and they hit American consumers buying finished products. So, when the administration threatens blanket tariffs, it isn't wielding a clean weapon. It's holding something more like a boomerang, one that loops back and hits domestic producers. That's why investors became cautious earlier this year. They expected costs to rise, they expected earnings to fall, and they pulled back before the actual impact was even measurable. This leads to one of the central contradictions in the tariff strategy. It was sold as a way to strengthen American manufacturing, to push jobs back to the United States, to make suppliers less dependent on foreign partners. But in practice, it's creating uncertainty that discourages long-term investment. Companies don't expand plants or hire new workers when they think the rules might change again in a few months. They wait, they hold cash, they delay decisions. And that delay shows up in slower industrial growth, in higher input costs, in more cautious capital spending. The political message may be one of economic independence, but the economic reality is a system whose gears grind because no one knows which rules to trust. Meanwhile, the global landscape is shifting in ways that amplify these weaknesses. Countries that once relied on the United States as their anchor are diversifying away, not out of hostility, but out of prudence. You see this with Europe seeking energy partnerships beyond North America, with Asian allies forming new trading blocs, with regional networks expanding in South America and Africa. China's influence, for example, has grown not simply because of its economic scale, but because it offers something the U.S. is struggling to provide: consistency. When you're building infrastructure or investing in manufacturing capacity, consistency matters more than rhetoric. This is where the Canadian example becomes especially important. Canada's response isn't just about avoiding short-term pain. It's about demonstrating reliability to the rest of the world. When a country shows that it honors its commitments, steadies its policies, and prepares for volatility rather than reacting to it, it attracts investment. It becomes a safe harbor in a turbulent global environment. That's part of why Canada continues to draw international companies even amid trade uncertainty. Investors value predictability, and right now, Ottawa is offering more of it than Washington. At the same time, Canada is experiencing its own domestic pressures. Businesses want clarity, provinces want assurances, workers want to know whether jobs are safe. But instead of making promises it can't keep or scrambling to win concessions that may not hold, the Canadian government is communicating a different message. We have planned for these scenarios. That preparedness doesn't eliminate the uncertainty, but it softens the blow. It gives industries a sense that they are not facing the storm alone and that their government understands the economic mechanics at stake. The Trump administration, by contrast, is wrestling with the consequences of its own rhetoric. When you spend years promising to rebalance global trade relationships through unilateral action, you have to deliver results that match the scale of those promises. But tariffs alone can't rebuild manufacturing, especially when production networks are globalized. And they can't reverse decades of investment decisions that were shaped by market forces, not political declarations. This mismatch between political goals and economic tools lies at the heart of the current tensions. If you zoom out even further, you begin to see something more fundamental happening. The United States once held enormous sway, not simply because of its economic size, but because of its role as a trusted partner. Trust is the currency that makes international systems work. Trust that agreements will be honored. Trust that policies will remain stable. Trust that political shifts won't upend economic rules overnight. When that trust erodes, even a powerful country finds itself operating with less influence than it expects. And the erosion is becoming obvious in how allies respond, not with anger, but with quiet recalibration. What makes this moment even more revealing is the contrast between how different countries are adapting to the same pressures. The European Union chose speed, accepting a reduced tariff rate simply to avoid a more disruptive shock. Japan moved quickly as well, calculating that a short-term compromise was better than a prolonged standoff. But Canada took a third path, one rooted in preparation rather than reaction. That decision highlights something many viewers might not fully appreciate. Leverage in trade negotiations doesn't just come from economic size. It comes from how well a country has planned for instability. When you prepare early, you don't negotiate from fear, you negotiate from options. And that's exactly what Canada has built for itself. Its industries have diversified supply chains. Its government has mapped out scenarios. Its exporters already operate under rules that shield them from the harshest penalties. So while the deadline looming over the U.S. talks has created a sense of urgency in Washington, Ottawa has been projecting steadiness. That projection is not accidental. It's a form of economic signaling. It tells markets and investors that Canada considers this turbulence manageable, not catastrophic. For workers watching this from their homes, the implications are significant. Tariff-driven uncertainty often triggers layoffs, delayed hiring, or reduced hours because businesses don't know what their costs will look like next quarter. But when governments build buffers, whether through trade agreements, subsidies, or transition plans, they help soften the shock. And that stability has real consequences for the lives of people who depend on factories, supply chains, and cross-border commerce. It means your job, your paycheck, or your business is less vulnerable to political theatrics. This brings us to an important question. Why is the United States struggling to convert tariffs into meaningful advantages? The answer lies in the difference between pressure and persuasion. Tariffs create pressure, but they don't necessarily persuade. They don't encourage other countries to change policies unless those countries see a clear long-term benefit in doing so. And in this case, the proposed deals being offered by Washington don't seem to offer that benefit. They look temporary, rushed, and subject to reversal with the next political shift. Without predictability, you don't get cooperation, you get hesitation. Another part of this story is the divergence in political strategy. The Trump administration is relying on public spectacle to demonstrate strength, but economic negotiations rarely turn on spectacle alone. They turn on the fine print that shapes market access, supply chain rules, and investment certainty. Canada is focusing almost entirely on those mechanics. By refusing to escalate rhetorically, it is keeping the debate grounded in structure rather than sentiment. That gives it an advantage. Emotion can dominate headlines, but structure determines outcomes. Meanwhile, American companies are adapting in ways that complicate the administration's narrative. You have firms rerouting shipments, adjusting supply lines, and shifting sourcing strategies to minimize tariff exposure. In some cases, they are increasing production abroad rather than bringing it home, which is the opposite of the stated goal. When policies push companies toward complexity rather than clarity, the impact is rarely what policymakers intended. The tariffs were supposed to repatriate manufacturing. Instead, they are accelerating global diversification. This disconnect is why investors reacted so strongly earlier in the year. They weren't responding to actual declines in revenue. They were responding to the uncertainty created by policy swings. When expectations fall faster than conditions deteriorate, markets behave as if the economic damage is worse than it truly is. And when companies withdraw guidance because they don't know what to predict, analysts respond by lowering estimates. That produces a cycle where fear drives forecasts more than fundamentals do. Canada's leaders understand this dynamic, and they're trying to avoid feeding it. Their approach is based on the idea that consistency can be a competitive advantage. In a world where political volatility is increasing, offering a stable framework becomes more valuable. You see this clearly in the electric vehicle sector. Despite the U.S. pulling back major incentives and reshaping its subsidy structure, Canada is holding its line. It is maintaining commitments, supporting projects already underway, and signaling to automakers that it will not mirror Washington's unpredictability. That matters because industrial investment operates on long timelines. Companies are planning production cycles that stretch decades into the future. They need to know that the environment will support those plans, not unravel them suddenly. Canada's decision to maintain its commitments, even in the face of uncertainty, shows an understanding of that horizon. It reassures manufacturers that projects in places like Windsor and St. Thomas will not be derailed by short-term political shifts, and that reassurance can be more powerful than any immediate financial incentive. At the same time, Canada is engaging in something much bigger than sectoral planning. It is redefining its broader economic posture, reducing exposure to U.S. supply chains, deepening ties with Mexico and Europe, and pursuing new partnerships in Asia. It is building a strategy designed for a world where the United States is no longer the central gravitational force in global trade. This isn't about abandoning the U.S. as a partner. It's about preparing for a reality where diversification is not optional but essential. What makes this shift so important is that it reflects a deeper structural change in the global economy. For much of the post-war era, the United States anchored a system built on open markets, predictable rules, and shared commitments. That system is now fragmenting. Countries are hedging their bets. Investment is flowing into regions that offer stability, and soft power, things like educational exchange, development assistance, and diplomatic presence, is playing a larger role in determining who sets the norms. This brings us back to the erosion of trust. Trust is what allowed the U.S. to lead, but trust depends on consistency, and consistency is exactly what recent American policy has struggled to provide. When commitments change with each administration, when subsidies appear and disappear, when trade rules are rewritten on short notice, partners begin to doubt the reliability of the entire system. And once that doubt takes hold, influence slips. You can see the consequences of that erosion playing out in the responses of longtime allies. Instead of confronting the United States openly, many are simply adapting around it. They are forging new agreements with one another, strengthening regional ties, and diversifying their economic dependencies. Japan and South Korea deepening their energy partnerships with Canada is a perfect example. These countries aren't severing ties with Washington, but they are creating new pathways that make them less vulnerable to abrupt policy swings in the U.S. That kind of quiet disengagement is often more telling than loud diplomatic statements. For Canada, these shifts present both risks and opportunities. On one hand, any disruption in cross-border trade with the U.S. poses challenges for Canadian workers and companies because the economies are so intertwined. But on the other hand, the current environment gives Canada a chance to showcase something the global economy is increasingly hungry for: policy stability. In a world of short attention spans and political volatility, being predictable has become a strategic asset, and Canadian policymakers are leaning into that asset with unusual clarity. This is particularly visible in the electric vehicle sector, where Canada has chosen not to mirror the U.S. reversal on subsidies. The U.S. administration's decision to repeal or shrink many of its own incentives created an unexpected shock across the industry. Automakers feared losing consumer demand. Investors worried that new factories might no longer be viable. And some companies paused or slowed their projects because they didn't know what policy environment they were stepping into. Canada responded by reaffirming its commitments, not because the risk disappeared, but because abandoning those commitments would undermine its long-term industrial strategy. When Ontario officials say that every dollar previously committed will remain committed, they're signaling that Canada is playing a long game rather than chasing headlines. For the tens of thousands of workers in auto manufacturing, battery production, and supply chain support, that signal matters more than any short-term political messaging. It means that job creation plans are still on track, even if the U.S. shifts direction. It means that factories under construction are still expected to open. And it means that Canada is willing to absorb short-term uncertainty to protect long-term opportunity. That is a very different approach from one that reacts to every twist in U.S. policy. And that difference is becoming one of Canada's economic calling cards: the willingness to maintain commitments, even when the ground is shifting. While all of this is unfolding, the U.S. is confronting its own contradictions. Tariffs were supposed to strengthen domestic industry, but many American companies continue to rely heavily on global supply chains. When tariffs raise input prices, those costs are eventually passed on, sometimes to consumers, sometimes to businesses, sometimes to both. The idea that tariffs alone can rebuild manufacturing assumes that companies will shift production back home. But companies make decisions based on efficiency, access to skilled labor, regulatory environments, and long-term certainty. Higher costs don't automatically translate into higher U.S. investment. Sometimes they just push companies to relocate production to other low-tariff countries. And this creates a tension at the center of the U.S. strategy. The administration wants to project power through economic pressure, but the pressures often land unevenly and unpredictably. You can threaten partners with tariffs, but you can't force companies to change their global footprints in ways that defy basic economic logic. When policymakers fight the underlying structure of supply chains instead of working with it, the results rarely match the rhetoric. And when the rhetoric is louder than the results, the gap becomes hard to ignore. Meanwhile, China is capitalizing on all of this. It has responded to U.S. tariffs with its own countermeasures, but more importantly, it is strengthening relationships that compete directly with U.S. influence. Massive investments through its Belt and Road Initiative give developing countries new options. Retaliatory tariffs signal that Beijing won't absorb economic pressure quietly. Restrictions on strategic exports remind the world that China controls key materials needed for advanced technology. And all these moves together highlight a fundamental shift. China no longer behaves like a country trying to fit into a US-led system. It behaves like a country building an alternative to it. For U.S. policymakers, that shift represents a strategic challenge far greater than any one trade dispute. Influence is not just about economic weight. It's about whether other countries want to align with you. When allies feel uncertain about your reliability, and when rivals offer stability and long-term investment, the global balance begins to tilt. This doesn't mean the U.S. is losing its position overnight, but it does mean that the world is becoming more multipolar and that unilateral pressure tactics carry less authority than they once did. Against this backdrop, Canada's quiet defiance stands out even more. It's not driven by ideology or nationalism. It's driven by a sober assessment of incentives. If a rushed deal doesn't improve market access, if it creates constraints without delivering benefits, and if it's vulnerable to reversal with the next political cycle, then it simply isn't worth taking. By refusing to be hurried, Canada is pushing the conversation back to substance. It's saying that good policy can't be dictated by deadlines designed for political drama. For viewers trying to make sense of this, it's important to understand the human side of the equation. Behind every tariff, there are workers whose shifts might get cut. There are families worried about rising prices. There are small business owners trying to plan inventory months in advance. Policies built around sudden escalation don't give those people the stability they need. And when countries respond with preparation rather than panic, they help protect households from unnecessary economic shocks. This brings us to a key point. Trade policy isn't just about governments negotiating with one another. It's about communities. It's about the people assembling cars, processing food, transporting goods, or running small manufacturing shops. When the rules change suddenly, those people feel it first. And when the rules change too often, they lose trust not only in policymakers, but in the system itself.